In the summer of 2023, in a stretch of the Sahara where surface sand can climb past 65 degrees Celsius, a team of researchers pulled dozens of sealed containers off a truck and started opening them, one at a time. There was no ceremony to it, no cameras waiting for a big reveal, just a line of plain metal boxes, and inside them, millions of bees, kept in a deep chill for weeks to slow their metabolism down enough to survive the trip. When the lids came off, there was no shelter waiting for them. No flowers, no water source anywhere in sight, just heat, sand, and silence stretching out in every direction. And then, for an entire year, almost no one touched them again. It's worth being clear about what this actually was, because it's easy to hear bees released into the harshest desert on Earth and assume the worst. This wasn't a stunt, and it wasn't cruelty dressed up as science. Every colony that went into the Sahara that summer was tagged, logged, and tracked. Researchers weren't measuring how many would die. That part was never in question. Some of them were always going to. What they wanted to know was whether any colonies could actually hold on, and if they could, what that would mean for one of the most fragile places on the planet, a dying desert oasis, slowly losing the last of its plant life. Here's the problem the researchers were up against before they even started. Honeybee colonies begin to struggle once hive temperatures cross roughly 40 degrees Celsius. A Saharan summer regularly sits close to 50 degrees Celsius in the shade, not in direct sun, in the shade. By every basic rule of bee biology, this experiment should have ended in the first few weeks. It didn't. And the reason it didn't is almost the opposite of what everyone assumed going in. Heat wasn't actually the biggest threat to these colonies. Silence was. Not the absence of sound, the absence of a food network, no steady source of pollen, no chain of flowers close enough together to move between. A single healthy colony can need millions of individual flower visits a year just to keep functioning at a basic level. And in large stretches of the Sahara, the thin ring of vegetation clinging to the edge of an oasis can nearly disappear after only a few weeks of hot, dry wind. Once that thin margin is gone, a loop starts that is brutally difficult to break. Fewer plants mean fewer bees. Fewer bees mean less pollination. Less pollination means fewer seeds. Fewer seeds mean even fewer plants the next season, and the cycle tightens again. Researchers have a name for this: pollination collapse, and the genuinely unsettling part is that it never announces itself. There's no single dramatic moment where everything visibly falls apart. The oasis still looks green from a distance. There's still water sitting in the ground, but underneath all of that, the numbers are quietly sliding every single year. Fewer insects, fewer seeds, less pollen moving between plants. Until one season, there simply isn't enough left to recover from. By the time it's visible, it's usually already too late to reverse. This isn't just a Sahara problem, and it isn't a distant abstract one either. Roughly 75% of the world's food crops depend at least partly on pollinators to reproduce. California alone needs more than 2 million bee colonies trucked in every single year just to keep its almond industry functioning, not thriving, just running at a basic level. Over the winter of 2024 into 2025, beekeepers across the United States reported losing around 60% of their colonies in a single season. 60% in one winter, in one of the most heavily managed beekeeping industries on Earth. In parts of Western China, the situation has already crossed a line most people have never heard about. Wild bee populations there have thinned out so severely that farmers in some regions now pollinate pear and apple trees entirely by hand, climbing through the branches with small brushes, moving pollen flower by flower, doing the exact job insects used to do for free. Sit with that for a second. Human beings, with paintbrushes, standing in for an insect that used to handle the work automatically, at scale, for nothing. That's not a warning about some distant future. That's already the reality on the ground, right now, and this is exactly why the Sahara experiment ended up mattering for a lot more than anyone originally planned. The researchers weren't just watching whether bees could survive extreme heat in isolation. They were watching what happens to an entire ecosystem when its pollination layer starts to fail in real time, under the harshest conditions available anywhere on the planet. In a strange way, the Sahara is close to a worst-case stress test. No buffer, no backup food source, no margin for error if something goes wrong. If a pollination system can hold on there, even barely, it's a strong signal it can hold on almost anywhere else too, which is what made the next part genuinely surprising. Some of those colonies didn't collapse. A portion of them held on, month after month, through the worst of the heat. And it wasn't the colonies you'd expect, not the biggest ones, not the strongest, or the most aggressive, or the ones that had looked healthiest going in. The reason behind that changes the way you think about survival, not just for bees, but more broadly. At first, researchers assumed the biggest challenge would simply be temperature, and the obvious fix would be to breed or select heat-resistant bees, or engineer heat-resistant hives. Straightforward enough, on paper. But after several months of continuous observation, something unexpected started showing up in the data. The bees that were still alive hadn't changed anything about their bodies. They had changed their schedule. In the colonies that survived, peak activity shifted to right before sunrise. Flight almost completely stopped through the middle of the day. Then the bees came back out in the late afternoon and into the early evening, sometimes well after dark. In other words, they stopped trying to fight the sun directly and started working around it instead. If that sounds familiar, it's because nearly every other animal that survives long-term in true desert conditions does something similar. Fennec foxes hunt at night. Scorpions stay buried under the sand through daylight hours. Desert gazelles cut their movement down to almost nothing when the sun is at its highest. None of them try to outlast the heat head-on. They simply avoid the hours when it's at its worst. What made this strange is that bees, historically, aren't supposed to behave this way. Daytime activity is close to part of their basic identity as a species. It's one of the most consistent behavioral patterns across almost every honeybee population studied. And yet thermal cameras set up near several oasis zones in Algeria recorded sand surface temperatures exceeding 65 to 70 degrees Celsius during peak daylight hours. Within just a few hours of sunset, that same ground had dropped by more than 25 degrees. That narrow window, roughly 2 to 3 hours, starting once the sand had cooled but before full darkness set in, turned out to be when almost all of the meaningful activity in the ecosystem was actually happening. The plants, it turns out, had already figured this out long before the researchers noticed. Several species of desert flower in the study area were opening later in the day than they typically would elsewhere, holding onto their pollen longer and releasing a noticeably stronger scent after dark, essentially signaling, in their own way, that they were open for business once the temperature dropped. The bees and the flowers had independently shifted onto the exact same schedule, with no coordination between them, no external intervention, just two separate organisms arriving at the same solution to the same problem on their own. This is roughly the point where the experiment started asking a different question entirely. A recent review of dryland ecosystem data found that nocturnal pollinators play a meaningful role in close to 90% of the dry ecosystems studied, and the overwhelming majority of that activity happens while researchers, and honestly almost everyone else, are asleep. Decades of desert fieldwork, setting up cameras, collecting samples, publishing findings, have mostly happened during daylight hours, for entirely practical reasons, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. For a very long time, scientists studying desert ecosystems may have been missing roughly half the actual story, simply because they weren't watching at the right hours. The Sahara was never a dead ecosystem. It's an ecosystem running on a schedule that almost nobody was paying attention to, and once that realization set in, it quietly reframed the entire project. It stopped being a story about whether bees could survive somewhere extreme and became something more uncomfortable. How long has the basic picture of how deserts function actually been wrong? Here's the part that genuinely surprised almost everyone involved. The colonies that lasted the longest weren't the biggest. They weren't the most productive. They weren't the most aggressive at defending their hive. And they didn't produce the most honey. By almost every standard metric normally used to judge a colony's health, they looked like the weak ones on paper. But in the Sahara, being highly optimized turned out to be a liability rather than an advantage, Think about what a large, high-output colony actually requires to function. More water, more flowers, more continuous energy just to keep the internal hive temperature low enough to survive. When heat stress drags on for weeks at a time, those demands don't level off, but they compound day after day. The colonies with the biggest appetites, the ones built for maximum output under normal conditions, were consistently the first to collapse. Meanwhile, the smaller colonies, running on something close to minimum survival mode, consuming as little as possible, asking almost nothing from an environment that had almost nothing left to give, were the ones still standing months later. This is, in a fairly direct way, exactly how desert ecosystems have operated for thousands of years. Low consumption, no excess. Every unit of energy spent only when it's genuinely necessary. The desert doesn't reward ambition. It rewards restraint. And this is roughly where the experiment starts to feel a little uncomfortable, because in a lot of ways, modern beekeeping does the opposite of restraint, consistently, on purpose. For decades, commercial breeding programs have selected bees specifically for maximum honey output, gentler temperament, and easier management at scale, essentially engineering the ideal agricultural bee, compliant, efficient, productive under stable, controlled conditions. In the process, it's possible we quietly bred out one of the exact traits that keeps a colony alive when conditions stop being stable. The Varroa mite is a useful, real-world example of what that looks like in practice. It's a parasite that attaches to bees, weakens them physically, and spreads disease through an entire colony from the inside. It has been a major driver of collapse events across commercial beekeeping operations in North America, Europe, and parts of Asia for years now. Most commercial colonies today simply cannot survive a serious Varroa infestation without direct human intervention, chemical treatments, ongoing management, and a full seasonal maintenance schedule. Remove the beekeeper from the equation entirely, and a large share of those hives don't make it through the season. Meanwhile, certain wild African bee populations, less domesticated, considerably harder to manage commercially, and far less optimized by any conventional standard, have shown genuine resistance to the same parasite. Not full immunity, but real resilience. The kind that doesn't depend on an outside intervention schedule to survive. The Sahara experiment didn't set out to make this exact point, but the data ended up making it anyway. The organism that survives longest isn't necessarily the one built to perform best under ideal controlled conditions. It's the one that hasn't forgotten how to function once those ideal conditions disappear, and that gap between optimized and genuinely adaptable appears to be getting wider, and not just in bees. After nearly a full year of continuous monitoring, the Sahara did not turn green. There was no dramatic carpet of wildflowers spreading across the dunes, no river suddenly cutting through the sand, no single before and after photo dramatic enough to go viral on its own. And honestly, that was always the realistic outcome from the start. Bees don't create water out of nothing. They don't manufacture soil, and they can't conjure rainfall out of dry air. What they do, what they've always done, is stabilize whatever fragile life is already trying to survive nearby. They make fragile things slightly less fragile. That's essentially the entire job. So what did a full year of monitoring actually show, in concrete terms? At several oasis sites, fruit-bearing rates among native trees increased measurably. Some species of wild desert flower extended their seasonal blooming window, staying active longer than they typically would under normal conditions. Small insect populations clustered around remaining water sources ticked upward as well. None of it was dramatic. None of it was the kind of result that generates headlines on its own. But taken together, it confirmed something genuinely important. Even in one of the most resource-depleted ecosystems on the planet, a functioning pollinator chain can still produce a real, measurable ripple effect through the wider system. The chain still works, it just needs something to restart it. And this is exactly where results like this tend to go wrong. The moment there's any visible sign of success, any green shoot, any small uptick in the data, the instinct almost everyone has is to scale it up immediately. More bees, more trees, bigger projects, faster timelines. turn a small proof of concept into a continental-scale restoration effort. It sounds like the obvious next move. In practice, across North Africa and the Middle East, that exact instinct has backfired repeatedly for decades. Several large-scale tree planting initiatives in arid zones drew so heavily on underground water reserves to keep newly planted trees alive that they actually accelerated the very desertification they were supposed to reverse. Other projects introduced non-native plant species that altered soil salinity over time, making the land harder for anything to grow, including the native plants that had been quietly surviving there, largely undisturbed for centuries. The land in question didn't need rescuing in the way these projects assumed. It needed to be left alone, mostly, to keep doing what it already knew how to do. The Sahara doesn't need to become a forest for this to matter. A single functioning oasis that keeps its trees alive for another 50 years matters. A pollinator chain that prevents even one more native plant species from disappearing locally matters. Small, stable, and resilient counts as a genuine win here, even when it doesn't photograph particularly well. Maybe the single most important result from this entire year of observation had almost nothing to do with bees specifically. It was the reminder that ecosystems don't necessarily need humans to fix them. What they need, more often, is for humans to stop assuming that fixing something automatically means making it look like somewhere else entirely, somewhere greener, lusher, more visibly productive by conventional standards. The desert was never broken to begin with. It was simply being exactly what a desert is. And that distinction, between broken and different, turns out to matter enormously. Here's a fact that most people have genuinely never heard, and it's worth sitting with. Every year, hundreds of millions of tons of dust lift off the surface of North Africa and travel west across the Atlantic Ocean. Some of it settles in the Caribbean. A portion keeps traveling. Tens of millions of tons eventually fall over the Amazon rainforest, carrying phosphorus with it, one of the most critical nutrients tropical trees actually need to grow and sustain themselves. Let that sit for a second. Part of the Amazon, one of the most biologically dense, visibly alive places on the entire planet, is being fertilized continuously by the Sahara, by a place most people look at and instinctively read as empty, by a landscape most people fly over and quietly think of as wasted space. The desert that looks the most lifeless from the outside is, in a very literal sense, quietly feeding the forest that looks the most alive. And once that connection becomes visible, the same underlying pattern starts showing up everywhere else in this story. Small bees quietly holding a food chain together, nocturnal insects carrying out essential pollination work while everyone else is asleep. A single oasis anchoring an entire micro-ecosystem across hundreds of square kilometers. Desert dust crossing an entire ocean to nourish a rainforest thousands of miles away. None of these processes are dramatic on their own. None of them generate headlines. None of them are especially easy to photograph in a way that spreads on its own. But remove any single one of them from the equation, and something downstream eventually collapses. That's ultimately what this experiment quietly demonstrated. Not that bees single-handedly saved the Sahara, not that science has somehow reversed desertification on a meaningful scale, but that the places routinely written off as worthless are frequently doing something invisible, ongoing, and genuinely irreplaceable. And it usually takes something going wrong or someone stopping to actually look before anyone notices at all. There's a habit, a fairly consistent one, of measuring the value of a place by how closely it resembles somewhere already familiar and approved of. Green, lush, visibly productive by conventional human standards. The Sahara fails essentially every one of those tests, immediately and obviously. And yet maybe the most honest thing this entire experiment offered wasn't a data set at all. It was a different question to ask the next time a place looks empty from a distance. Not, how do we fix this? But, what is this place already doing, quietly, that we simply haven't noticed yet? Nature has rarely been as fragile as it's often assumed to be. It's just that a significant amount of what keeps it functioning happens at night, underground, or across distances too large for casual observation to easily track. The bees didn't transform the desert into something else. But spending a full year watching them try to survive there quietly changed how the people watching understood it. And in the end, that shift in perspective might turn out to be the more important result of the two.